one of the things that you will notice as I go through, explaining my methodology is that in terms of artistic types, there is this delusion, or maybe a reality for all I know, of artists who are operating in some mysterious and unstructured and unprogrammed fashion. And to a degree, I do that. But my background is in applied design and in an approach to art projects and design that does use a system in a way and very organized methodology. And the idea behind that is that the more you know about your craft, and my craft is the craft of sculpture, and that's a very specific language, by the way, the more you know about it, and the more you know the tools, and the tools are the physical tools that we use if you're a traditional artist like I am, and also the tools are like, let's say, thinking tools, all right, analytic tools. The more you know about these things, the better you can actually participate in the continuum of your craft. There is a species of artists, usually described as artist craftsmen, if you will, who view themselves as part of a continuum. And we simply participate in our craft during our lifetime. We extrapolate what we can from the artists who existed before us, the artists that we share our space with now, and we are all working very hard, but enjoying every minute of it, pushing this big ball of sculpture, down the humanist road, if you will. And that's a very specific way to view oneself as an artist. In English, it translates actually into a very familiar word in relationship to the church, which is vocation. Now, vocation is a word that generally seems like church business. Well, actually, vocation it's a word like liturgy. Liturgy is not, church property. It's just a word that describes a dimension of the church. Liturgy, in its earliest sense, simply means a ceremony, and then it expands from there. And in a kind of a way, this approach to working as an artist with kind of a system, and I do actually work in my studio in rather a ritualized and very maddening way to everybody else, putting the tools in proper order and all that sort of thing. And it's the typical artist craftsman kind of thing. It's a way of going. It doesn't mean you live in an insight-free world. It just means you have a kind of a way of dealing with complex issues. And the Stations of the Cross actually are very complex. It's a seemingly simple narrative, but over a period of time, it's been dealt with by countless of artists in many, many ways, and it just isn't an easy thing to just march up to and get your head around, if you will. I did 2 Stations of the Cross as commissions, and one for actually a church goods manufacturing company, which was they were a very nice firm, and they did a tremendous amount for me as an artist, actually. And by that point, I realized that I had some ideas that I wanted to pursue within the framework of the Stations of the Cross that I couldn't easily do for a client. This was during the, maybe 60s in that area. And although there were churches that had embraced Vatican II and were seeking change visually, there were other churches that were very focused and insistent on what is called the corpus of Christ in every panel. And I think we've all seen Stations of the Cross like that. And we have restored a lot of those, incidentally, because after the big rush of the 60s and 70s of getting rid of all those quote-unquote old things, those old things are now being dragged out and repaired by people like us, actually, and re-implanted because not every priest who learned to play the guitar in the 60s, wants to keep his ponytail onto the, into forever. And there's been some shifts back to more traditional, constructions within churches. I mean, this is just, fashion within as it were. But during that era, even then, there were very conservative churches, and I did one of that type, and one where anything went in a way. So what I decided to do, and I had just enough experience with the Stations of the Cross and what it does within what I call a teaching machine. And this is a teaching machine and a learning machine. I mean, maybe I'm using the word machine a little strangely, but if you view this as that, then these objects on the wall cease to be decor and art objects in themselves, but they become part of that mechanism. And that's what they have to be. That's how they work. That's their function, okay? And in applied design, we tend to see things in this way. And so for this Stations of the Cross, my plan was to deal with a number of visual devices that normally are not easy to build into something as structured as the Stations of the Cross. So the approach was this. First, the square format. It is the neutral visual form of architecture, and yet it is slightly more modern. So it just sends a little bit of a signal that this is going to be a modern approach. The second feature is the gray, consistent color of the panels. Now, there's a very good reason for that. If a person comes in this space and chooses not to deal with those Stations of the Cross, and that's most people most of the time, they should not have whatever their personal space, if you will, invaded by these things on the wall going, see me, see it. Do you know what I mean? These things have to be, they have to be repressed until a person seeks access into the message, all right? The other thing that works great for the modulated gray tone is that the general expectation of a Stations of the Cross is the traditional ones, prior to Vatican II and even after that. And if you flip through the websites and catalogs of religious good dealers, you'll see a lot of them. And they traditionally have the crucifix in every panel, the apparent corpus of Christ in every panel, the Roman numerals in every panel. And this repetitiveness is part of the devotional process and part of the learning process and a necessity within a church that simply chooses that. I'm not critical of that, and I have done Stations of the Cross with all of those features built in. These are just, let's say, architectural choices, if you will. But those don't exist in these panels. And the easiest way to deal with the problem of them not existing is to have the panels so neutral and so, quote unquote, soft, that unless you go up and start looking at them, you don't even sense the absence of those. So a person whose personal requirements are the traditional Stations of the Cross can survive these stations. They simply are not going to embrace them because they don't work for them and they don't work with their methodology of dealing with the stations. After I had these up in a couple of the churches that I showed them in, I noticed that some people came in and went to one station in particular, and I asked the priest there what that was all about, and he explained to me that in his pastoral work, he encouraged people to focus and embrace one particular station as, quote unquote, their station. And so some people regularly go through all the stations as some sort of a journey, if you will, a spiritual journey. Other people are fixated on one station and actually go to it for whatever personal and communicative reasons, which is an added kind of responsibility to the thing. So then I had this third proviso I had to meet. I had to make each station somehow at least connotate what the basic meaning of that traditional station was. So what I did was I organized all 14 panels, and I restricted myself to this coloration and this format. Then I introduced the first let's say, and not a controversial element, but an element that works in the 20th century better than any other time, and that is what we call cinema verite, which was developed in the 20s and 30s, and it's a technique whereby when you watch a film, the filmmaker has you see what the protagonist does in the film. So it's not new, it's just innovative perhaps, to apply it in this circumstance. And I was very interested in filmmaking, and so I used filmmaking as slightly kind of a device to design the panels. Basically, the second thing that I extrapolated from film is building, and in a way in musical structure, it occurs too, where you construct the narrative, and then if there's a more complex way to interpret it, you then can break it into two more pieces, and you have a three-part narrative. So as you go around the stations, the first 6 stations, although none show the person of Christ, because the suggestion and the underlying idea is that you are seeing what he sees. That in the first 6 stations, the pictorial scale, if you will, is the same. So we enter into storytelling, and they're all in that scale. And I think that's very important because it lets someone engage with the narrative, and then we can move into other ideas beyond that. When we come to the 7th station, there's a particular phenomenon involved with that, and it touches something that we all possess, but we're not that tuned into. And that's when you fall, we as primal animals are trained to stop ourselves from falling. And when your brain knows you are falling, your eyes focus the length of your arm. And this is every animal scientist will explain that to you. And we are animals too, that's the way it is. So that little phenomenon that's in that 7th panel, where suddenly it's the size it would be if you were 30 inches away from it, or 25 inches, is the shift. And from that shift on, I am actually dealing slightly more with things that are triggered from within ourselves, okay? And then again, I repeat that on, say, the 8th station and 9th station. And then on the 11th station, it's returning a little to this scale that we have over here, and it's what Christ would have seen. He sees somebody preparing the cross for the crucifixion. In the 12th station, there's a sense of him seeing himself on the cross. And there's that removal that anybody who has gone through a particularly traumatic experience actually achieves. I mean, you actually see yourself from outside yourself. So there is nothing novel about that device, but in this context, it has to be kind of implanted to make it work well. But I think that it's valid to ask someone simply to become Christ as you go through the whole series of panels.